In the grand chaotic landscape of first-person shooters, ambition and scale set the stage for those who want to be on a gamer's radar. It's these expectations that drive companies to break boundaries and redefine a genre. But sometimes, this ambition can lead to disaster if not planned properly. For every success story you hear, there are hundreds, if not thousands of failures that came before it. Many games have tried to soar to new heights, only to be brought crashing back down due to technology constraints, time crunches, and even catastrophically bad luck. And this is one of those stories. Back in 2010, a video game set a Guinness World Record for the most players in a console FPS match, a feat many thought was impossible. It was hailed as the future of online gaming. So why then, in just a few years, did its servers go dark, its studio shut down, and the game itself vanished, nearly becoming lost media? This is the tragedy of MAG, and one of gaming's most ambitious failures. Let's rewind back to the year 1995 and meet two founders, Jim Bossler and Brian Soderbergh. These two would be responsible for Zipper Interactive, an American video game company based in Redmond, Washington. Many of you probably recognize them for the SOCOM series, dating back to 2002 on the PlayStation 2. While the company would find relative success with the SOCOM series, this was also a company that knew what it was doing when it came to shooters. And Sony would take note of this, and on January 25th of 2006, Zipper would be acquired by Sony and added to its collection of exclusive development studios. Sadly, this wouldn't last long, because on March 29th of 2012, Sony would announce that Zipper Interactive would be closed, apparently due to resource realignment. This closure would be confirmed the next day by Sony Computer Entertainment. Prior to its closure, Zipper Interactive was working on two unannounced titles for the PlayStation 4 before both projects were cancelled once the closing was complete. One of them was another entry in the SOCOM series, and the other was a first-person shooter meant to be a new IP. Now, to understand why MAG was such a big deal, we need to remember something. At the time MAG was released, the 100-player Battle Royale wasn't the norm yet. Previous to MAG, one of the biggest player counts in an FPS we had seen was from the Resistance series, with the Resistance 2 having a total of 60 players in a match. To add to this, COD was setting the precedent for what the FPS arcade shooter should be, and Battlefield was known as the large-scale FPS. Not only this, but of course there was also Halo on the Xbox. This was a time where these games were starting to become titans of the FPS genre, so it would be relatively difficult for a new game to stand out amongst these. I mean, what more could you possibly do? They've already set the grounds for anything new in the genre, right? But then Sony's E3 press conference rolls around, and Zipper drops a nuke. They announced a new IP that, in all honesty, sounded a little bit too good to be true. Well, I guess not a little bit. It really sounded too good to be true. But for the early 2000s Sony fans, Zipper meant something. You knew they were a capable company because of SOCOM. They were a company that understood the ins and outs of network code, and they were banking all that experience on their newest project, codenamed Massive Action Game, or MAG for short. The special and revolutionary premise? 256 players in one match at the same time on a console. Even by today's standards, most battle royales don't exceed 100 players. And even then, how many of those battle royales have even less than a 100 player count? We've only seen Battlefield dip its toes into that with 2042, and well, we know how that went. To say this sounded like a load of baloney would be an understatement. It just didn't seem like it was feasibly possible at the time, especially the fact it would be on a console. How would a console, and a PlayStation 3 for that matter, handle all that network traffic? Even PlayStation's president, Jack Tretton at the time, said it pushed the PlayStation 3 to its screaming point. Zipper's solution? An entirely new server architecture, built from the ground up for this one purpose. For FPS games, there are four main network types that they may use: client-server, listen servers, peer-to-peer, and local area network. Now, which of these did MAG use, you may ask? Dedicated servers. Kind of. It's a little complicated. I'm not entirely sure about this, as the only info I could find was from a discussion board on Unity and some of the commenters talking about it, but we'll just roll with it. Zipper Interactive achieved MAG's unprecedented 256 player console concurrency on the PlayStation 3 through a combination of proprietary custom server architecture and intelligent data culling. Okay, so what does all this jargon mean? Instead of trying to process all 256 players on the server at the same exact time, which would be a nightmare, Zipper built a tiered server infrastructure that effectively aggregated multiple smaller network zones into one large battlefield. Basically, if you're on one part of the map, you are in a zone or a server spot on the map. That was also why if you managed to achieve some crazy speed and started racing through the map, you would start to get a lot of desync issues. You only got information on players within your subsector and those closest to you. This drastically reduces bandwidth and processing requirements. The PlayStation 3 also had the Cell broadband engine, which Zipper would take full advantage of, heavily utilizing its synergistic processing units to handle heavy compression and decompression of network packets on the client side. Finally, rather than relying on peer-to-peer hosting, the developer used custom, purpose-built dedicated servers. This centralized approach ensured stability and fair tick rates without putting the burden on a single user's console. Now yes, this multiplayer online-only game does in fact have lore. The optimism and harmony of the 2010s were completely eradicated by 2020. A global crisis loomed. Food shortages sparked riots, currencies plummeted, fuel reserves dwindled, and oil-producing nations began to ration what remained. It is a dark future. Governments earmarked money for humanitarian efforts, overseas security, and intelligence services which, over time, found its way to the coffers of a small group of private military contractors, corporations, and companies. These private armies then began to recruit aggressively. Soldiers without a country. The contractors fight wars that never happened. This is the nature of the Shadow War, where the three biggest PMCs, Valor, Raven, and SVER, are the focus. The three contractors all have their own style. Valor is based in Alaska, but their territory extends through the Americas. Their recruits are seasoned war vets from the UK and the Americas. Valor has a classic military style. These guys are the classic heroes of the three factions. Raven is based in Austria and tend to recruit from Europe, including the UK, out of which Valor also recruits. However, anyone who studies Raven recruiting information such as maps would realize that their personnel hail from as far as Western Russia, and to the Middle East including countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, etc. They are the most technologically advanced faction, and their soldiers are trained with the state-of-the-art equipment, but have little real combat experience. The SVER is based in the Chechen Republic and recruit from the Middle East, Asia, and Eastern Europe. They have also been known to recruit from the UK. They are opposite of Raven, with little in the way of technology and funding, but their ranks are comprised of soldiers who have been fighting in wars all their lives. Don't be misled, for they all have an equal chance of winning the Shadow War. Also, do not be deceived by their terrorist looks. They are more like freedom fighters. The game also had an RPG-like mechanic with the class system. You could level up your character to 70, unlocking skills, weapons, and armor. The skill tree was way more flexible than the rigid classes of its rivals, letting players create hybrid roles. You could be a sniper, who was also a bomb diffuser, or a heavy weapons expert who could also act as a medic. This freedom gave players a real sense of ownership over their soldier, and once you hit the level cap, you could enter veteran mode, to switch to another faction and start over, keeping your stats and earning an XP bonus, which added huge replayability. But 256 players in one match sounds like chaos, just waiting to happen. What about an objective? Who's in charge? Is anyone going to listen? Well, Zipper had the answer to this. Rather than both teams just being made up of two giant teams of individuals, both teams were broken up into 8-player squads, with 4 squads forming a platoon, and 4 platoons forming a company. Each squad is led by a player who has advanced through the game's ranking system. Character statistics and development also increase with frequent gameplay. The players most advanced in rank will be able to either direct the battle or participate directly in combat. The chain of command was to have a fix in place to stop the game from becoming one giant bum rush towards the other team. Now, with that being said, just because someone is on the squad or a team doesn't really mean they'll play with said squad. So even though Zipper laid down a foundation for the team play, it wasn't finished just yet. So what exactly would give players an incentive for team play? Players that did well could be promoted to SLs, then the next step would be a platoon leader, and the top dog would be the officer in charge, or OIC. The OIC got to be in charge of the entire 128 players on their team. You would get a strategic view of the battlefield and have access to powerful support options like artillery strikes or mortar barrages. This dynamic creates the sense of a real-time chain of command and constantly changing objectives. Maybe the OIC needs a squad to move to the east side of the map while the rest of the squads push towards the objective. A single well-led squad could turn the tide of a skirmish, and a smart OIC could win the entire battle. For the first time on a console, the strategic layer of war was put directly into players' hands. It was a system that demanded communication and leadership. This was Zipper's promise, a game that would deliver not just massive battles, but meaningful ones. The stage was set. Oh, also as a final note here, aside from the comm channels, there was proximity chat. Yes, the funny chat where you hear someone scream in the distance as they get further and further away. On January 26, 2010, Massive Action Game launched exclusively for the PlayStation 3, and in many ways it actually delivered on its impossible promise. Loading into a 256 player match for the first time was kind of astonishing. The scale was something like you'd never seen before. All of these soldiers running up and people yelling orders and placing markers on the map, all real players. As you parachute in from the sky, you just take a moment, letting it all sink in, that this is actually a game, and everyone in it is a real player. Organized chaos, and it was fun. Now for me personally, I do remember playing this. I was a little kid at the time. I was maybe like 8 or something, I don't even really remember. What I do remember is parachuting in, running to a door that had a mark on it. We were supposed to blow up the door, and I think everyone died. That was my experience, at least from what I can remember. Now, the game did have multiple game modes, but not every single one had 256 players at all times. The smaller ones like Suppression and Sabotage had much less players, but 64 players is still quite a lot. The next game mode, Escalation, would house 96 players, then Acquisition and Interdiction having 128 players, and then finally, Domination would house the massive 256 players, which is what most people wanted to play, of course. For a brief period, MAG was a glimpse of the future of the FPS genre, a massive scale battlefield with a chain of command system in the game. The experience is something that honestly no other game has managed to achieve for me. The closest I've ever gotten to MAG is playing Squad, but it's still not the same. Unfortunately, the seeds of failure were already planted. For all this innovation and ambition, the game still lacked in a lot of places. The launch was rocky. Players immediately ran into technical and design issues that soured the experience. Also, the controls felt clunky compared to the polished feel of Call of Duty. The frame rate, while mostly stable, could dip into what felt like walking through mud during big firefights, and of course the load times were long. The worst of this was the spawn system. Spawn camping was bad, like really bad on some maps. Remember the parachuting I talked about? Yeah, well imagine spawning in, and every time you do, you get sniped before you even make it 100 feet above the ground. To make matters worse, with the massive scale of the game, they needed some spawn points to be fixed points, meaning they are the same spawn point every single game. So if you knew where the enemy spawn point was, you could just camp in a good choke point and never let them get out. And for a game that prided itself on teamwork, many felt the tactical depth was surprisingly shallow at first. The game was already losing players, and in the age of the hyper-competitive FPS market, that just isn't good. You had an extremely short window to make an impression on COD, Battlefield, and Halo players, and MAG was struggling to even retain the players that wanted to give it a chance. But Zipper didn't want to give up. As I mentioned before, this company was reliable. They listened. And just a month after launch, they released patch 1.03. This wasn't a minor fix, it was a dramatic overhaul. It rebalanced every single weapon, fixed bugs, and repaired some of the broken spawn loops. And later patches addressed exploits like team killing. Slowly but surely, the game started to transform. The developers' dedication was paying off. MAG was becoming more stable and more balanced. The community, which had nearly given up on the game, began to stabilize and even grow. MAG was turning into the game it was supposed to be, a cult favorite cherished by a dedicated fanbase. MAG survived the rocky launch, but a new problem would be on the horizon, and it would be one that no one was ready for. Also, if you like what you see so far, consider subscribing to the channel. I've got plenty more games to cover in this series, and I let you guys vote on which one you want covered next. By the spring of 2011, MAG was in the best shape of its life. The patches had molded it into a genuinely great online shooter. A dedicated community had formed, and the game was on an upward trajectory. Now, whether you believe it's bad luck or not is entirely up to you, but we can all agree that sometimes life just sucks, right? Well, it certainly did for the PlayStation on April 20th, 2011, the day known as the 2011 PSN hack. The attack occurred between April 17th and 19th, and was the result of an external intrusion on Sony PlayStation's network, in which personal details from approximately 77 million accounts were compromised, and prevented users of PlayStation 3 and PlayStation Portable consoles from accessing the service. The attack would force Sony to deactivate the PlayStation Network servers on April 20th. The outage lasted 24 days. And this happened suddenly. People tried to log in on the 20th, and they were met with errors. Initially, people thought it would only last a day or two, but then it turned into a week, and then a couple of weeks. and then 24 days later, the network would be back online. Nearly an entire month the servers were down. While most people would see this as an extremely annoying inconvenience to not be able to fuel their gaming addiction, for fans of MAG, this would essentially be the equivalent of a firing squad death sentence for their game. Remember, MAG was online only, so nobody could play it this entire time. It had no single player campaign, no offline bots, no co-op mode, and no offline training mode. Without a connection to the PlayStation Network, the disc in your console was literally useless. The game was, for all intents and purposes, erased. For 24 agonizingly long days, an entire community was locked out. And in the fast-moving world of online gaming, 24 days is an eternity. Players who had made MAG their go-to game had no choice but to seek refuge elsewhere. I mean, this outage couldn't have occurred at a worse time, honestly. MAG was starting to turn itself around. By the time the servers came back online in May, the damage was already done. Players moved on. The servers, once bustling with the chaos of 256 players, were suddenly empty. Many players who left during the blackout simply never came back. The trust in the platform was also shattered, and the momentum that Zipper had worked so tirelessly to build was gone. The PlayStation Network outage was truly the point of no return for MAG, and the worst part is that it was a disaster that no one could prepare for or change. It's one thing when a game has a bad launch, poor balancing, or maybe it just needed more time in the oven. But your console's network being hacked? I mean, what are you supposed to do? The aftermath of the PlayStation Network outage cast a long shadow over Zipper's shooter. The once thriving battlefields of MAG grew noticeably quieter. While a core of dedicated players remained, the game never reclaimed the critical mass of players it needed. For a game built for 256-player warfare, a dwindling player base was a fatal problem. It became harder and harder to fill domination matches, and the grand scale that had been its greatest strength now only highlighted the emptiness and shrinking player base. It was clear to Sony, MAG was a game that had not paid off. For all the effort that was put into it, it failed. Sales figures were okay. While it had a strong start selling around 500,000 copies within the first month, Sony and Zipper would re-release it as a greatest hits title, getting total sales to over 1 million. But this would not be enough, as it wouldn't stay relevant enough to earn any more sales. The combo of a rocky launch, niche appeal for large-scale battle, clunky gameplay, poor performance issues, and the insanely catastrophic PlayStation Network outage would seal the fate of MAG. The troubles for Zipper also wouldn't end there. Zipper's other franchise, SOCOM, was also struggling. SOCOM 4 released just before the outage, and it was met with a mixed reception. With 2 new titles underperforming, Zipper's legacy was looking grim. And that would all be true less than a year later after the outage, when Sony would announce that they were shutting down Zipper Interactive. After 17 years, the studio that had pioneered large-scale console combat was closed. Just like that, the masters of online multiplayer were no more. With its creator gone, MAG was on borrowed time. Sony kept the servers online, but with no team to provide updates or content, the game was in a state of limbo. The remaining community held on, staging battles in a world they knew wouldn't last. For almost 2 more years, the Shadow War continued as a faint echo. Then in late 2013, the final nail was driven into the coffin. With the PlayStation 4 on the market, Sony announced it would be shutting down the servers for several older PlayStation 3 titles. On the list was SOCOM Confrontation, SOCOM 4, and MAG. The date was set, January 28th, 2014. The end was sad and anticlimactic. There was no grand finale. In the final hours, the last soldiers of Valor, Raven, and SVER logged on one last time. They fought their last battles and watched as the player count evaporated. Then, at the appointed hour, the connection was severed. The servers went dark forever. An error message was all that remained. Massive Action Game, the game that once held a world record, was now completely and permanently unplayable. So what's the deal? Was MAG a good game or not? Did it deserve its set-in? Yes and no. Look, I can agree that I love this game. I actually played it, and I loved the idea of it, but not the game itself. Without looking at this game from a nostalgic perspective, it was just okay. It's like a bargain bin game that you'd buy from GameStop. Maybe you weren't able to get COD or Battlefield at the time, so you just had to settle for one of the other off-brand shooters. The game, and again, this is speaking from an unbiased standpoint, it was not that good. Gameplay-wise, it was just kind of average and not well polished. It was, unfortunately, not a smooth game. An FPS needs to have extremely crisp and smooth gunplay. If it's clunky at all, and you feel like you're fighting the game and controls more than the players, you're not going to enjoy it. Not only that, but again, balancing. Nobody likes to be spawn camped or run down the same corridor over and over again. Does that mean you're a loser if you still enjoyed it and thought it was fun? No. because you can enjoy a game that other people might not. But speaking from a technical standpoint, no, the game just wasn't that good. Also, from comments I've seen, the factions were unbalanced as well. A lot of factors went into this game not being able to achieve the same level of success as something like COD. While yes, it's nice to look back fondly on this game and be like, oh my gosh, remember that MAG game that could do 256 player battles? That was awesome, we need that game back. We also can't be blind to the fact that the game was in fact not the greatest thing since buttered bread. MAG's legacy is one of pioneering ambition. It was a game ahead of its time. It proved over a decade ago that 256 player battles were possible on a console. While modern titles like Battlefield 2042 are celebrated for 128 player matches, MAG had already doubled that a full generation prior. It also set the stage for console shooters to have a more grounded approach to combat and a chain of command system, which paved the way for games like Hell Let Loose and Squad to find a place on the console. The true tragedy isn't that MAG was bad, while it did have its many faults. By the end of its cycle, it was by all means a fun game. The tragedy is that this ambitious game could have been something greater. We could have even seen a sequel to it, one that improved upon the mechanics and had even better balancing. But this would be halted due to an external force like the PlayStation Network outage. Today, MAG is rarely talked about outside of the gamers that played it and only those that still remember it. Most people like to ask the what ifs. What if it had been more polished and balanced? What if the PlayStation Network outage didn't happen? What if it got a second chance? Unfortunately, none of these questions will ever be answered and will simply remain as nothing more than pure speculation. Massive Action Game is a ghost of a future that almost was. It's a heartbreaking story about ambition and the unforeseen tragedy of uncontrollable forces. It reached for the stars with its grand scale, and it nearly touched them, until it all came crashing down and fading into nothing more than one of gaming's most ambitious failures. How many of you got to play MAG, and what did you think of it? Am I wrong to say that it wasn't as good of a game that people remember, or was it actually better than COD and Battlefield? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to watch more dives into games like this, consider watching my previous videos, or even subscribing to the channel for more future content. Remember to like and subscribe, and I hope you have a good morning, good afternoon, or a good night.